So who fights fires and what jobs do they do? There are hundreds of different types of jobs when it comes to wildland fire. There are line crew members, and that's essentially what I do with my red card is I participate in a line crew, which means we cut fire line along the fire to sort of starve it from fuel. And we do other things like mop up and fuel mitigation as well. But there are also hotshot crews, and they typically would be assigned riskier projects, sometimes going into really dangerous areas to pull off really dangerous maneuvers in order to sort of get a leg up on that fire's progression. And then there are smoke jumpers, which are kind of the superheroes of the wildland fire community. They're, in a way, sort of like our Navy SEALs are elite. And what they do is incredibly risky. And they're very highly trained individuals. But there's also a whole tier of management with a fire. So wildland fire often is managed using the incident command system that all federal agencies use in emergencies and whatnot. And so ICS determines a whole hierarchy of the different sort of ways in which a fire should be managed. And so there are administrators, there are folks that deal with finance, with catering, with logistics, and another important is public information. And so a public information officer for fire is probably one of the most important jobs. Those people are doing media interviews. They are posting up updates in the different communities that may be affected by the fire. So they're constantly moving, constantly updating the public as to how the fire management is going.
When a fire makes the nightly news, they have set up a camp that mimics a small city. It's remarkable the number of resources that you have to throw at something like this. Sometimes you have structural engines that go on wildland fires and they get assigned structure protection. And essentially that's back into the driveway, protect the house behind you, and you're facing out in case you have to bail. But your only assignment is to protect that building behind you. And then you have wildland engines, type 3s and type 6s. Type 6 is more like a pickup truck with a flatbed skid unit on it. And those are out fighting the fire, cutting line, doing indirect attack.
When I work on a wildland fire crew, we check the weather on an hourly basis, and we actually take weather readings ourselves. So firefighters are equipped with sort of a bellwether kit that allows us to check the relative humidity, and we're also able to match that humidity up with the temperatures and the winds and the wind direction to sort of determine the probability of erratic fire behavior.
So we have whiteboards on the walls at the firehouse, and every year we put a poster up next to the whiteboard, and it's ERCs, energy release components, and it's tracked on a graph. So basically you see how high the ERC is over here, and then they pinpointed historical fires on this graph. And sure enough, you can just watch it as it goes up into the orange and into the red. All the fires you've heard about on TV are all when the ERC was up here. I used to predominantly just do structural firefighting in Bloomington, Indiana. There's not a wildland urban interface, if you will. And we used to think the guys that went and fought wildland fire were just nuts. They had less equipment, less protective clothing. They used aircraft, and it was just so outside the box of what we understood in terms of fighting fire. A structural firefighter doesn't want the fire any bigger. Like the minute I arrive, that fire shouldn't get any bigger than it is right there, right? That's what firefighters do. I show up, that's a problem, I'm going to make that problem smaller. Wildland firefighters show up and they make a conscious decision to go, it's gonna get bigger. I'm gonna just try and control that, right? And so for me to wrap my head around that, that was difficult for me to do. I just, red-blooded American firefighter, go in there and get it. And sometimes that's not the approach. If there's a house on fire, you go right at it. If it's in the living room, we drag a line in and we go in the living room and we put the fire out. And in most cases, you could do that with a wildland fire. It'd be a direct attack because the fire is small and manageable. But in most cases, you're going to do an indirect attack. And essentially what you're trying to do is you want to draw a box around that fire. If the fire is this big, then you want to draw a box this big, and you're looking for natural landmarks. You know, if this field out here was on fire, we'd use the parking lot on this side and the road on the other side is natural fire breaks, right? So you're trying to draw a box using some of the existing topography or development or whatever to draw that box for you. And where you can't use a road or a parking lot, then you're out there scraping line, you're digging in the dirt, trying to create a fire break. But you assess the size and the growth potential of the fire, and then try and draw a box around it. And the growth potential is what kind of fuel load is burning, what's the wind doing, what's the topography like, what's the weather like. All of that factors into our decision-making process on how big that box is. If the wind is moving really fast and the fuels are super dry and burning quickly, then our box is going to be way bigger than if it was, you know, middle of spring and things are still sort of green and not dried out yet. So a fire break is essentially anything man-made or natural that would stop the spread of a fire. Could be a roadway, could be a Forest Service road, just a dirt 2-track that runs through. When you see these larger fires on TV, the type 1 incidents, sometimes we're using bulldozers to create fire breaks because it's the only way that you can get them to stop. And fire breaks aren't guarantees because if the wind is blowing hard enough and strong enough, you'll get embers that blow across those fire breaks that start a spot fire somewhere else. So a fire break is essentially just something we've done or already existed in the topography of the land that just slows the growth of the fire.
How are government agencies trying to fight fires before they actually happen? I believe is the question, and they are doing their best to manage fuels, but they're incredibly understaffed. There's a lot of work to do, and it's hard to actually get those jobs done. And so it's a big job, and it doesn't pay a whole lot of money, and so recruitment can be challenging for government agencies. I think information is probably the most valuable thing that the government can do and does do, and that is to put information out to the public about how to appropriately and responsibly take care of natural places. And so I think information is probably the best thing that the government can do. But they're also sort of always evaluating their wins and their losses. We learn something from every fire that we fight. And so by going in and reevaluating all the steps that we took to suppress or to mitigate, then we can sort of see what went right and what went wrong. Some agencies like the National Park Service, they do their best to let fires burn, except when sort of historic or culturally important spots or places are threatened. I worked a fire a couple of years ago at Yellowstone National Park, and it was predominantly burning in a wilderness designated area, and so we really didn't do much firefighting. We were just letting that fire burn. We did have to do some mitigation and some fuel removal around some of the housing areas for park staff and some of the public areas. But again, that's our primary goal, is to sort of protect those structures. But in a wilderness type area, those burns are really needed. Different agencies like the Forest Service and the National Park Service, they do their best to do fuel management. And so they will go into the forested areas and to different sections of the park in which they're managing and reduce the types of fuels, which are shrubs and bushes and even small trees. And so they'll remove those plants, and oftentimes you'll see piles of that debris when you visit a park or a forest. And those are piles for prescribed burns.
In layman's terms, fuel management with regards to wildland fires is essentially trying to modify whatever the fuel environment is in a given area to make wildland fires less likely to happen or less problematic when they do happen. And so it wasn't uncommon for us to send crews out to neighborhoods that we would identify that have a higher risk because of where they live. They live in the foothills and offer to do things like thin trees, rake up dead and down, leaves, branches, that sort of thing that are around the house. Encourage homeowners to move the stack of firewood that they use for their wood stove away from the house. So anything you can do to sort of manipulate the fuel load or the availability of fuels to burn would be fuels management. The big difference between a naturally occurring and good for the environment type of a wildland fire as opposed to a catastrophic fire would be the availability of the fuel loads and the size. There was a period of time where the United States government thought the very best thing they could do was put every fire that ever started out. The problem that leads to is if the fires occur less and less frequently, the fuel load gets built up, and so by the time it does burn, because it absolutely will, the fuel load is just 10 times what it might have been if there had just been a small lightning start, every 3 years or what have you. And so if we could get back to a place where we were managing the fuels and allowing the fires to burn through on a smaller scale, then I think we'd probably see an improvement in the situation. But we've had decades of put everything that ever happens out. And a lot of that is because it's proximity to development, right? If we continue to build out into the woods, then we have assets at risk, right? We have buildings, we have people that are out there in the foothills, out there in the forest, and so we have an obligation to protect them. But there's got to be you've got to strike some kind of balance between managing the fuel load, allowing smaller lightning start type fires to burn through to revitalize the environment, as opposed to these the Marshall Fire or some of these larger fires that you see in California, where it's just thousands of homes destroyed, dozens of people killed, and hundreds of thousands of acres burned.